Panzer VIII Maus. The Panzer VIII Maus was the heaviest tank ever built, and it came from Germany near the end of World War II. It was meant to be a giant breakthrough tank, with armor so thick that most enemy guns would struggle to damage it. On paper, it looked almost unstoppable. In reality, its size became its biggest weakness. The Maus weighed far more than normal bridges could handle, moved slowly, used huge amounts of fuel, and was difficult to transport. Only prototypes were completed, and they arrived too late to affect the war. What makes the Maus bizarre is not just its size, but the idea behind it. Germany was already short on fuel, factories, and reliable vehicles, yet resources were still poured into a tank so heavy that simply moving it became a major problem. T-28 Super Heavy Tank. The T-28 Super Heavy Tank was an American armored vehicle built to attack strong German defenses, especially heavy fortifications. It looked less like a normal tank and more like a moving bunker. It had extremely thick frontal armor and a powerful gun, but it did not have a rotating turret. Instead, the gun was fixed in the front, which meant the whole vehicle had to turn to aim in a new direction. The T-28 also had 4 tracks to spread out its enormous weight, and the outer tracks could be removed for transport. It was designed with serious purpose, but by the time it was ready, the battlefield had changed. The war in Europe ended before it could be used. Its strange shape and slow speed show how far armies were willing to go when they imagined fighting through concrete, bunkers, and fortified lines. TOG-2. The TOG-2 was a British super heavy tank created by a group of older tank designers who still remembered the trench warfare of World War I. Its name came from the Old Gang, and that history explains a lot about its design. The tank was extremely long because it was imagined as a machine that could cross wide trenches and broken ground. But World War II had become a faster war, built around aircraft, mobile armor, and flexible tactics. The TOG-2 was heavily armored and carried a large gun, yet it was slow, huge, and outdated almost as soon as it appeared. Only one was built. What makes it bizarre is that it feels like a tank from one war trying to survive in another. It was impressive in size, but it belonged to a battlefield that had mostly disappeared. Bob Semple Tank. The Bob Semple tank was built in New Zealand during a time of real fear that Japan might expand further into the Pacific. New Zealand did not have a large tank industry, so the design was created using what was available. It was built on a tractor base and covered with corrugated steel armor, giving it a very unusual and homemade appearance. The tank carried machine guns rather than a proper tank cannon, and its protection was limited. It was never used in combat and later became famous as one of the strangest armored vehicles of the war. Still, it matters because it shows the pressure smaller nations faced during World War II. The Bob Semple tank was not elegant or advanced, but it was an attempt to create defense from limited resources at a frightening moment. Kugelpanzer. The Kugelpanzer was a small German armored vehicle shaped almost like a metal ball. Its name means ball tank, and it remains one of the most mysterious armored machines connected to World War II. Only one known example survives, and its exact purpose is still debated. It may have been intended for scouting, artillery observation, or some kind of light battlefield support. It had a tiny crew space and narrow wheels, with a rounded body that looked nothing like a standard tank. The Kugelpanzer was not a battlefield-changing weapon, and there is no clear evidence that it saw major combat use. What makes it fascinating is how strange and unfinished it feels. It looks like an experiment from a desperate period, when designers were trying unusual ideas in the hope that something might prove useful. Antonov A-40 Flying Tank. The Antonov A-40 flying tank was a Soviet attempt to turn a light tank into a glider. The idea was to attach wings and a tail to a T-60 tank, tow it behind an aircraft, release it near the battlefield, and let it glide down to support airborne troops. After landing, the wings would be removed and the tank could drive into action. It was an imaginative solution to a real problem. Airborne troops often lacked heavy support after landing. But the concept was far harder to use than it sounded. The tank was too heavy, the towing aircraft struggled, and the test flight showed how impractical the idea was. The project was abandoned, but it remains one of the most bizarre tank experiments of the war. It combined 2 very different machines into one strange design. Sherman DD. The Sherman DD was an amphibious version of the American Sherman tank, used by Allied forces during the Normandy landings. The letters stood for duplex drive because the tank could move both on land and in water. To float, it used a collapsible canvas screen raised around the hull, making the tank look almost like a small boat. Propellers pushed it through the water until it reached shore, where the screen could be lowered and the tank could fight normally. The idea was risky, but it had a clear purpose. Infantry landing on beaches needed armored support as quickly as possible. Some Sherman DD tanks were lost in rough seas, especially when launched too far from shore, but others successfully reached the beaches. Its strange floating screen made it look fragile, yet the concept played an important role in getting armor onto defended coastlines. Churchill Crocodile. The Churchill Crocodile was a British flamethrower tank based on the heavy Churchill infantry tank. What made it different was the armored trailer it towed behind it, carrying fuel for the flamethrower. The flame weapon replaced the hull machine gun, while the main cannon stayed in the turret. This meant the tank could still fight like a normal armored vehicle while also attacking bunkers, trenches, and fortified positions with fire. The Crocodile was terrifying to face, and it was especially useful against strong defensive points where ordinary weapons were less effective. Its design looked strange because of the trailer, which made the tank longer and more awkward. But the system worked better than many simpler flamethrower tanks because it allowed the Churchill to carry more fuel while keeping the crew inside heavy armor. Matilda Baron. The Matilda Baron was a British mine-clearing tank based on the Matilda infantry tank. It carried a large, rotating drum with chains that struck the ground in front of the vehicle, trying to detonate mines safely before other troops passed through. This kind of device was called a flail, and it turned the tank into something that looked more like a moving industrial machine than a weapon. The Baron was an early step in the development of specialized engineering tanks. It was not perfect, and later designs became more practical, but the idea was important. Minefields could stop an attack just as effectively as guns or walls, so armies needed machines that could clear paths under fire. The Matilda Baron mattered because it showed how tanks were being adapted for battlefield problems beyond simply shooting enemy vehicles. P.1000 Ratte. The P.1000 Ratte was a German design for a land battleship that was never built. It was imagined as a tank so huge that it would carry naval-style guns and tower over normal armored vehicles. The idea came from the same extreme thinking that produced other massive German weapon projects late in the war. On paper, it promised overwhelming firepower and thick armor. In reality, it would have been almost impossible to use properly. It would have consumed enormous resources, been difficult to move, and made an obvious target for aircraft. Roads, bridges, maintenance crews, and fuel supplies would all have struggled to support it. The Ratte matters because it represents the bizarre edge of wartime design, where imagination and ambition moved far beyond practical battlefield needs. It was less a useful tank than a symbol of how unrealistic superweapon thinking could become.